say you're a QAnon person, and they say that QAnon's a right-wing thing, and the only time I ever hear about it is on CNN.
Okay, so let's make a very clear distinction between Q and the Q posts or the Q drops and QAnon and the QAnon community.
Jacob, I don't know what any of these things are.
Okay, so let's break this down. Q is a psychological operation. Okay? Now, psychological operations are largely based on three factors. Number one is neuro-linguistic programming. That is the use of certain words, linguistics, to program the neurons or the pattern of neurons in the brain, in particular the subconscious portion of the brain, to affect the way that a person consciously perceives reality. Okay? Number two, you have something called critical factor bypass. Critical factor bypass is where you saturate the entirety of the environment in the media, newspapers, magazines, television shows, in the corporate world, in banking, you name it, in schools, colleges. You saturate all of them with a very specific message, and you repeat it over and over and over and over again. Okay? Now, what happens then is that the subconscious mind, because it sees it everywhere, it assumes that it must be true, that this has to be real because it's everywhere in the environment. Yep. So it programs, once again, the subconscious mind to affect the way the conscious mind perceives reality. Now, based on neuro-linguistically programming the individual and mass neuro-linguistically programming the populations through critical factor bypass, why they call it that is because your critical thinking is bypassed because it's programmed in the subconscious brain. That creates something called mass formation hypnosis, okay, where 25 to 30% of the population believes this external stimuli, believes and is programmed by this material.
They're just sheeple.
Okay. So in order for mass formation hypnosis to occur, that 25 to 30% of the population has to gain some sort of heightened level of radicalism where they scream the loudest and then they get a hold of the levers of power, right? Now, when it comes down to stopping this process from happening, all you need is 5% or more of the population to not become hypnotized and say, no, this is ludicrous, you are nuts, we are not doing that. Now, we've seen the effects of mass formation hypnosis, critical factor bypass, and neuro-linguistic programming in Nazi Germany. We saw it with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and the USSR. We saw it in the Red Revolution in China and the Chinese Communist Party, okay? So we've seen the effects of this process, and it is psychological warfare, okay? Now, when we saw in the Red Revolution in China and the Chinese Communist Party, okay? So we've seen the effects of this process, and it is psychological warfare. Okay. Now, when it comes to Q and the Q operation, and the reason I say it's a psychological operation is this. This is how it differs. The Operation Mockingbird media, what I call the Mockingbird media, Operation Mockingbird, CIA infiltrating the media outlets, yep. Right? So the Mockingbird media uses the techniques I just laid out to program the populations so that they can use this propaganda to go to war. And then they can transfer public money into private hands. You see? So it's a whole scheme. It's all about maintaining the status quo. Now, Q is on the internet. It first started on 4chan, then on 8kun. And when I was looking at it from an objective perspective, what I saw was that Q was asking people questions, not giving them answers. What does the Mockingbird media do? This is what happens. This is what it means. Giving people answers, neuro-linguistically programming people. How do you dissolve neuro-linguistic programming? How do you dissolve subconscious programming? You ask questions.
Why are they doing this?
So that's a great question. How do you dissolve mass formation hypnosis? You have to get at least 5% or more of the population to reject the programming, the hypnosis, the narrative, right? How you get people to de-neuro-linguistically program themselves. You ask them questions, and then they do their own research, right? And then they come to the conclusions on their own. You can't just tell somebody the government's corrupt. You have to show them. And you know who Yuri Bezmenov is?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the Soviet guy.
Yes, and he was a KGB operative in charge of psychological warfare, what they called ideological subversion, right? So think about this. Yuri Bezmenov said that the Soviets and the global communist conspiracy, which he said is very real, okay, and he would know, they infiltrate countries, in particular, he was talking about the United States, but all countries through a ideological warfare campaign, a psychological warfare campaign that is broken down into 4 parts. Demoralization, which takes a full generation, infiltrate the entertainment, infiltrate the schools, the colleges, infiltrate governments, infiltrate the media outlets, etc. Okay? Then indoctrinate or demoralize a whole generation of children. Then, after that, you get destabilization. Now, what ends up happening there is that once that whole generation has been demoralized, then you use the infiltrators that did the demoralization in conjunction with the demoralized generation. And then they destabilize the system. And that takes a couple of years. Then, once the system has been destabilized, that's when you get into the third part, crisis. So then this collapse of the supply chain, the failing of banks, the housing market crash, et cetera, et cetera. These are the crises that occur, right? Then the last part is normalization. And what happens is that during the crisis portion, these infiltrators that did the demoralization, destabilization, they move into positions of power, high-level positions of power. Then they normalize all of this stuff and they create a communist government, okay? So how does this relate to Q?
Yeah.
Right? How this relates to Q is this. There are entities within our government, within what some people would call the deep state, okay? The bureaucracy, the intelligence apparatus, military intelligence, that do not want to see the United States of America fall. They do not want a new world order, one world government. They do not want these less than 1%ers dictating our lives and the lives of our children. So the Q operation was done so that this demoralized population, which Yuri Bezmenov said, you could show people in black and white the truth and they won't believe it because they're so heavily demoralized. You could take them to the concentration camps and they will not believe it until they're behind the gates, right? How do you deprogram people? You give them questions, they do their own research, they come to their own conclusions, and they see the government corruption on their own. They see the fences, they see the gates, and they realize the system, then what they have been told is for their security is actually for their enslavement or their imprisonment. And all it takes is 5%, right? So we have in the United States far more than 5% who can see through the BS.
Yeah,
right?
Certainly. I mean, if you're defining that as people who know that the media and the government lie to us all the time, it was probably like 65%. I don't know, it seems like a lot of people.
Yes.
And that's been true for a while.
The 3 main things that Q was talking about and that I think are the most important are the fiat debt-based currency and the Fed, okay? Number 2, the child trafficking, human trafficking networks, the slave trade, right? Number 3, the government corruption and how it's rooted in these things and how the government is using its monopoly on the initiation of force to enforce this new world order, one world government and subjugate anybody that's going to dissent, right? That's in my opinion, right? Okay. Now, infiltration instead of invasion, according to JFK, that's what we're talking about here, right? Infiltration instead of invasion. So if the entities that are running the global governments, the banks, the child trafficking networks, using them to blackmail people through like, Jeffrey Epstein and stuff like that, control governments, et cetera. If these individuals are doing all of that, then how is it that you're going to convince enough of the population that this thing is actually happening? They're going to have to look into it themselves and find all the dirt themselves, right? But that's not, look at it like this. If those people that are trying to keep all of this hidden are trying to stop QAnon or trying to stop Q from doing this, what are they going to do? They're going to create a straw man. QAnon, a right-wing conspiracy theory, right? That believe that there's reptilian overlords governing the world and all this other stuff. Then they're going to also infiltrate and say JFK Jr. is alive and he's Donald Trump's vice president.
Yeah, I saw something about that JFK Jr. has something to do with QAnon.
Yeah, well,
but he doesn't?
Well, or that the earth is flat. Okay, so what this is about is these very real concepts of debt-based currency, child trafficking, government collusion, and blackmail, and all that stuff. They become then contaminated by JFK Jr., flat earth, reptilian overlords. And then so anybody that believes this other stuff, now gets painted as a kook because the media shines the light on that portion of the population that's infiltrated.
So, and you're saying even the term QAnon is that's
It's
just
bullshit.
okay. So